Well, Jim, you perked my interest late last fall. We were exploring at Upper House this idea of what it means to be a good neighbor. And I came across that article you wrote, Loving My Neighbor in a Technological World. And so I just wanted to dive into that a little bit. I thought the article was really great, really helpful as we think about 2024 and kind of what's ahead of us. But wondering, like, what should we be aware of and where should we be hopeful in our future relationship with technology?
Well, I wrote that article after rewatching the movie Her.
Oh, yeah.
Which came out like 10 years ago.
Yep.
Joaquin Phoenix, Scarlett Johansson is the voice of the artificial intelligence digital assistant that you wear. And I rewatched it just because it seemed to be coming so much closer to reality, right?
Yeah.
With artificial intelligence developments, particularly over 23 and ChatGPT. And so I rewatched that movie, and one of the things that really stuck out to me from watching that again is moving toward having these digital companions, digital assistants that take the place of human interaction. And I want to not be an alarmist in this regard, but one of the most, I think, formative things when I think about technology and technological developments has been one of the things I mentioned in there. There was a guy called Melvin Cranberg that wrote something about the laws of technology. And the first one, which is the one that gets talked about most of the time, is that technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. Right. So it's really easy to say with any technological development, it could be used for good things or it could be used for bad things. Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think the more interesting question behind that is, okay, but what does it do to us, regardless of whether we're using it for good or ill? And you can give some interesting examples of that, like the automobile. So America is built pretty much on us each having a car and being able to drive someplace. I had a friend who moved from Europe and took a job teaching at a big Midwestern city that didn't have great public transportation. And she was writing about her experience of this, of saying, one of the really interesting implications of this is that I don't know my neighbors now, because in Europe, we all walked to the end of the street together to get onto the bus, and we'd see each other every day in that regard.
Yeah.
And we might even say, in addition to that, electric garage door openers have made it so that you drive to your house, you press a button, you go in, you close the door behind you, and you never interact with the people that are around you in ways that we used to. And again, I'm not saying that's a good thing or bad thing in and of itself, but it changes something about us.
Yeah.
So my question, particularly about loving my neighbor in a technological world, was how does it change us if we are interacting primarily with people who are not in our physical proximity, right? Because my neighbor used to be defined by the people who were around me physically.
Yeah.
And now for most of us, our neighbor, the people we interact with, we have social communities that are defined by social media and are defined virtually more so than they are defined geographically.
Yeah.
And so I'm really curious about teasing out the implications of my neighbor not being the people that I'm right next to. So you asked about hope in that regard too.
Yeah.
And I guess the hope is that we as a people, we as a community, and we as the church primarily, understand those changes in ways that we're still able to live out the gospel, right? So if loving my neighbor, if I'm called to love my neighbor, and I ask the question that was asked of Jesus, who is my neighbor?
Yeah. Right.
He answers that by telling the story of the Good Samaritan.
Right.
How would we answer that now when we're asked, who is my neighbor? It makes me think of these people in the South Pacific that I talked to about climate change. Are they our neighbor? Are they somebody for whom we ought to have this kind of concern? So I'm hoping that that there's some fairly substantive discussion in the church about that question. Who is my neighbor when my neighbor is my interactions are defined so much more digitally than they are by physical proximity?
Yeah. Well, I even think about my own family. We have 2 high school students in our family, and, there have been moments where, our younger kids are in bed, the older kids are, we're all in the living room together. No one is talking. Everyone's on a device doing something. And there's been moments where I've just said, no, we're putting it all away. So I think that those interactions just penetrate into everything, right? Even our own family structures that we have in this. I think the power of technology has expanded our reach, which has been interesting, and we'll be able to connect with others from all over the world. But we don't often know, like you were saying, kind of those that are in proximity to us. How have you seen even technology change in your own interactions with others over these last few years?
So since I started working for BioLogos full time in 2015, I spend most of my day sitting right here, looking at this screen, interacting with people. Since COVID happened, a lot more of those interactions happen on Zoom calls or whatever.
Yep.
But technology has definitely made it possible for the kind of work that I do to do it all from sitting right here, as opposed to being with people. And and particularly then during COVID. So I'm fairly introverted by nature, in the sense that I gain energy from times by myself rather than gaining energy from being out with people. But even as an introvert like me, I was like, man, I got to go and see I got to go out, and I have to be around some people again here at some point.
Yeah.
So there's definitely been so prior to doing this, I was a professor. So and it was in person. It wasn't digitally. So I spent a lot of time in physical proximity to people like that. Some pros and cons, because again, technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. So what does it do to you? I have a much broader impact. My work has a much broader impact today than it did because of technology and the digital footprint that BioLogos has, and the podcast that I speak to, however many thousands of people each week through that. But I don't have as deep of an impact as I did when I have 30 students in this class every day that I'm talking to and interacting with at a much more substantive level than happens through this. So those are trade-offs. And understanding those and trying to find ways to work to maximize the benefits and minimize the costs, I think is an important question of how we do this work.
Yeah. When I think of kind of like a real life example of this in practice, I think about the upcoming 2024 presidential election. And I think about interactions online. So a friend posting something that an individual finds absurd about a candidate on social media. How best do we respond to something like that? Just that as an example. How do we be a good neighbor to that individual when we strongly disagree or even think it's absurd how they're interacting or backing a candidate?
Boy, if I had the answer to that, I could write a book and make a lot of money, I bet. So when COVID hit, we at BioLogos thought this really might be, as awful and horrific as it is, this really might be an opportunity that we see people coming together. And even in the science and faith world, where there's so much animosity toward warring camps there, this might be a way that brings people together and on board. And you look back now and say, wow, was that a naive thought? Because it did the exact opposite.
Yeah.
It pushed people further away in that regard. So I just think it's so important for us to remember that these people who are saying things that to us are so obviously wrong and ridiculous think the same thing about the things that we say. And to at least start that by injecting a little humility into the interaction to understand that what I think is so obviously true and correct feels that way, feels as wrong to them as what they're saying feels wrong to me.
Yeah.
And that might at least give me a chance to step back, and in responding with little grace and humility in the sense that I'm not just going to bring out the big club and start beating you over the head. Because it turns out that doesn't work very well.
Yeah,
it doesn't work very well.
Right.
So even from BioLogos, I mean, one of our core values at BioLogos is gracious dialogue, and we hear from people regularly who say, "I'm not so sure I agree with everything you guys agree with and say you believe, but I sure appreciate the way you conduct the conversation." Yeah. As opposed to some other groups that I might find myself agreeing with more, but I don't like the way that they talk to each other. Gracious dialogue is hard, and it's only gotten harder in the last couple of years. But to start from that perspective that I've got to be wrong about some stuff, right? None of us is infallible, so I have to be wrong about some things myself. So instead of just bringing out the big certainty club and whacking people with it because I know I'm right about everything, maybe listening and hearing the pain behind some of those comments that are made, or understanding that there's another circumstance and another context within which that seems reasonable to them. And so trying to work from that is, I think that's probably the best I have to offer.